While it's common to hear that ADHD is simply about lacking dopamine, the reality is far more complex. In this video, we will look into the neurobiological mechanisms underlying ADHD to see how dopamine pathways, particularly the reward system, function differently in terms of motivation, reward processing, and reinforcement behavior, explaining phenomena that the simple lacking dopamine videos won't explain. For example, why concentration in ADHD can actually be good in some settings, why people with ADHD typically don't struggle to concentrate on video games, why they thrive in environments with many immediate rewards, and why punishment doesn't work well for kids with ADHD. To begin with, we need to have a closer look at the reward pathway whose functioning is altered in ADHD. This is a pathway leading from a structure called the VTA to a structure called nucleus accumbens. It releases dopamine in the nucleus accumbens when we experience a reward. Let's say we taste something good, we find money on the street, or we receive a compliment. The brain then wants to remember what was leading to this reward to try to encourage behavior that might result in the same reward again. It does that by looking at all the things happening just before getting the reward in order to find clues for possible rewards. Let's say a noise, a smell, or simply the activity that you were doing that made you end up with a reward. If you experience the same thing with a reward following for several times, your brain will now start releasing dopamine from the reward pathway as soon as it recognizes the cues. That is important as dopamine in the nucleus accumbens is what makes us want to do a certain thing. In short, it gives us motivation. After some time, the brain will always release dopamine in response to the cues of the upcoming reward, but no longer when the reward itself arrives, a phenomenon we call the dopamine transfer. To learn more about this and have it demonstrated with some examples, watch my video about the reward system. So what happens with ADHD? The dopamine transfer deficit hypothesis claims that this transfer of dopamine released from the actual reward to the time when you get the first cues of an upcoming reward is ineffective. Therefore, people with ADHD may lack the motivation to engage in otherwise boring or exhausting activities, even though these will lead to a reward later on. Of course, the dopamine transfer is not always totally ineffective for people with ADHD. Otherwise, they would be entirely unable to do even the simplest thing and not come out of bed all day. To understand better how it is altered for them and when it works better, we have to look at something called the delay of reinforcement gradient. It states that the more time that passes between the cue and the reward, also called the reinforcer, the harder it is for the brain to do the dopamine transfer to the cue. This requires more repetitions, and the dopamine release at the time of the cue will be weaker. This is why it is generally easier for us to be motivated for something that provides immediate rewards. People with ADHD, however, seem to have a steeper delay of reinforcement gradient as shown in this graph. When the reward follows the cue immediately, there's no difference between them and non-ADHD people, but the longer the delay, the greater the difference in how effective the dopamine transfer is. The fact that people with ADHD choose actions that lead to immediate rewards instead of actions that lead to a larger but delayed rewards has been demonstrated in many experiments. What does this mean in daily life? Imagine a child with ADHD in a classroom. Their brain will focus on small things that provide immediate rewards rather than those that offer delayed, larger rewards, like looking out of the window because of a noise, scratching an itch for relief, or feeling a bit thirsty needing to drink. However, the brain will release little to no motivational dopamine when it comes to focusing on schoolwork, as the reward, for example not having to finish it at home, is too far in the future. This is why people with ADHD often thrive in environments where immediate actions lead to immediate rewards. It explains why kids with ADHD don't struggle to concentrate on video games, as there are many small rewards throughout the game. It also explains why they can focus on tasks that they are generally interested in, because being interested in it makes the task itself rewarding, so no dopamine transfer is needed. The reason why the dopamine transfer doesn't occur is a matter of debate. In the dynamic developmental theory, it is argued that this is because of low tonic and phasic dopamine release. But what is that? If you've seen my video, The Reward System Part 2, you know. Otherwise, here's a short explanation. As mentioned before, the reward pathway releases dopamine in response to reward prediction and unexpected rewards. This is the phasic dopamine release, where dopamine levels increase rapidly until it is reuptaken into the neurons by transporters. However, neurons continuously release small amounts of dopamine which remain in the area until they are also reuptaken by transporters. This is called tonic dopamine release. Tonic and phasic dopamine influence each other because tonic dopamine binds to certain receptors that inhibit phasic release. So what is different in ADHD? While researchers widely agree that people with ADHD have lower tonic dopamine levels, it is not yet fully proven how the phasic levels are altered. The developmental dynamic theory suggests that phasic levels are also lower, leading to the insufficient dopamine transfer. But what does the strength of the dopamine release have to do with the dopamine transfer? For dopamine transfer to occur, a process called long-term potentiation is required, which is a mechanism to strengthen synapses, the connections between neurons. In the case of the reward pathway, all kinds of information on neutral stimuli come from different neurons to the reward system and try to activate it, but their synapses are typically too weak to activate the reward system. Until the brain wants to make a dopamine transfer to one of these stimuli. It then uses long-term potentiation to strengthen its synapse so that it is strong enough to activate the reward pathway and lead to the anticipating dopamine release in future events. Long-term potentiation is happening with a difficult process within the neuron where genes are activated to build more receptors. And this process is actually more likely to happen under the influence of dopamine. So this is where the dopamine release at unexpected rewards comes into play. We already know that there is a dopamine release whenever we experience an unexpected reward. Under the influence of this dopamine, all synapses that at that moment deliver information about neutral stimuli will go through long-term potentiation and therefore be strong enough to activate the reward system next time to lead to an anticipating dopamine release. The dopamine transfer happened. So you could say, whenever there's a dopamine release, there's some long-term potentiation for all the things that are happening, so they will lead to an anticipating dopamine release next time. But when there's little phasic dopamine to begin with, as the dynamic developmental theory suggests is the case for people with ADHD, there's also no or only a little dopamine transfer, as dopamine is lacking to support long-term potentiation. The dynamic developmental theory also explains some other important points. Researchers argue that extinction of reinforced actions is reduced because of the low tonic dopamine. That is because extinction of a behavior happens because of a reduced tonic release when the expected reward doesn't happen. So you will have an anticipating dopamine release, the reward prediction, because you have a stimulus that was followed by a reward earlier and got reinforced. But then the reward doesn't occur anymore, and the reward pathway will respond by lowering the tonic dopamine, which will lead to an extinction of the reinforcement. After some repetitions, the stimulus will no longer activate the reward pathway for an anticipating dopamine release. When the tonic dopamine concentration is already low to begin with, there's a so-called floor effect. It cannot be reduced that much more and the extinction is ineffective. That could explain why it is difficult for kids with ADHD to learn from their mistakes, and it explains why punishment seems not to work that well on them. But it can also explain hyperactivity. Let's say we get an unexpected reward and the reward pathway tries to connect it to all the things that we did. Essentially, it cannot always be sure which of all the actions led to the reward, so initially it might create a small dopamine transfer for all of them. In the following situation, it is doing the differentiations, because the wrongfully reinforced actions will soon be extincted again because no reward is following anymore, but not for people with ADHD, where extinction doesn't work properly. So basically, the hyperactivity could be the result of many wrongfully reinforced actions that don't get extincted again. That can also explain why kids with ADHD are less hyperactive in new environments. They are confronted with many new stimuli that have not yet been wrongfully reinforced. Keep in mind that this process happens unconsciously. So even if it sounds strange, since it is often logical what is good for us and leads to rewards, the reward pathway will still go through all these steps to make the dopamine transfer and thus create motivation for the right action, what it believes. This explains the discrepancy we experience between knowing what we should be motivated for and what we actually feel motivated for. We should, for example, be motivated to exercise because we know it is healthy and prevents us from having a heart attack later in life. However, your reward pathway doesn't know that since you've never had a heart attack. But it does know that watching a TV show will likely provide funny and entertaining moments, so that's where it creates the dopamine transfer. As a result, that's what you feel motivated to do and probably end up doing. Back to the hyperactivity in ADHD because of wrongfully reinforced and never extincted actions. Working with kids and adolescents with ADHD, it is very noticeable that the degree of hyperactivity varies greatly from patient to patient. This could be explained by differences in how steep the delay of the reinforcement gradient is. If it is extremely steep, very few actions will be reinforced and therefore very few will be wrongfully reinforced. It could also be due to some having even lower tonic dopamine levels than others, meaning extinctions works more or less effectively, while they still face the same issues with reinforcement due to similar levels of phasic dopamine release. However, the theories discussed can unfortunately not explain all ADHD symptoms. While motivation, impatience, focus, distractibility, and hyperactivity can be explained, it fails to explain why people with ADHD are typically very forgetful, inattentive in conversation, and disorganized. This has likely to do with dopamine pathways from the VTA to the prefrontal cortex, as the prefrontal cortex is involved in memory and executive functions. And it makes sense, with ADHD being a mainly genetic disorder, the genes that will lead to alterations in the functions of dopamine neurons will likely affect all dopamine neurons and not only in some brain regions. So with all of this, how does medicine work? Most ADHD medications block the dopamine transporter that transports dopamine back into the neuron. When it is blocked, tonic dopamine levels will rise, eliminating the floor effect and therefore making it possible to extinguish wrongfully reinforced stimuli and thus reduce hyperactivity. And the phasic dopamine levels? There is actually a debate whether phasic levels are increased or decreased by therapeutic dosages of ADHD medication. The blockage of the dopamine transporter will, without a doubt, delay the reuptake of phasic dopamine, which would make its signaling stronger. However, higher tonic dopamine concentrations would also inhibit phasic dopamine release through autoreceptors like mentioned before. Which of the two actions is stronger at therapeutical dosages has not completely been shown yet, as it is very difficult to measure phasic release and different experiments show actually different results. For the dynamic developmental theory to make sense, the phasic release should be increased by ADHD medication, so that the dopamine transfer can happen under the influence of phasic dopamine release at times of unexpected reward, and there are experiments that support that. For example, that the overall dopamine release increases by taking medicine when doing rewarding tasks, something that will release phasic dopamine, but not when doing a neutral activity as looking at natural pictures. There are, however, other researchers who claim that the phasic release is higher in people with ADHD, caused by a lower inhibition of a lower tonic dopamine concentration. They say that medication reduces the phasic release by increasing the tonic dopamine that then inhibits the phasic activity. They say that ADHD symptoms actually stem from a hyperactive reward pathway, which leads people with ADHD to be distracted by all the reward cues around them, which is why they cannot stay on task and tend to change the activity all the time. The next decades of research will hopefully show which theory was right, but keep in mind that more than one theory can be right, with different theories representing different subtypes of ADHD, which could also explain the need of different types of medication and individual dosages. If you liked my video, leave a like and follow my channel. On my channel you can also find other videos about the reward system and other neurobiological topics.